The sheriff ordered him out of the courtroom. 10 minutes later, everyone discovered he was the one person in the room who had the authority to stay. The morning began quietly inside the Superior Court building in a small Texas county. Sunlight passed through the tall courtroom windows, staff members organized documents, and attorneys prepared for another busy day of hearings. Nothing appeared unusual until Sheriff Thomas Whitaker entered the room. He was known throughout the county as a confident law enforcement officer who believed strongly in order and control. His badge represented years of service, and he carried himself with the certainty of someone who expected people to follow his direction. Near the front of the courtroom stood a man calmly reviewing a folder of documents. He was dressed professionally but simply, without a large group around him or anything that immediately revealed his position. His name was Adrian Brooks. To anyone who did not know his story, he looked like another person preparing for a day inside the courthouse. But appearances rarely tell the entire truth. Adrian had spent more than 2 decades building a career dedicated to justice. He had studied law, served communities, and earned the trust that eventually led him to become the chief judge of the court where he was standing. Yet, on that morning, he was not wearing the traditional judge's robe. He was simply preparing for the day ahead, just as he had done many times before. Sheriff Whitaker looked at Adrian and made a quick assumption. He saw someone he believed did not belong in that area of the courtroom. He did not see the years of experience behind Adrian's calm expression. He did not see the responsibility carried by the man standing quietly before him. He only saw what appeared on the surface. Adrian noticed the misunderstanding, but he did not react with anger. He did not immediately announce his position or use his title to change the situation. Instead, he remained composed. Throughout his career, Adrian had learned that moments of pressure revealed a person's true character. He understood that justice was not only about having authority. It was about knowing how to use authority with patience and fairness. Imagine standing inside a courtroom where your entire career could change the situation instantly, yet choosing silence because you believe truth does not need to be forced. Imagine being judged before anyone knows your name, your experience, or your contribution. That was the moment Adrian Brooks faced. Around the courtroom, a few people began noticing that something felt different. Court staff members recognized the confidence and familiarity Adrian carried. Attorneys exchanged uncertain looks as they sensed there was more to the situation than anyone first understood. Sheriff Whitaker remained focused on his decision, unaware that the quiet man before him was not a visitor, not an outsider, and not someone who needed permission to stand there. He was the person responsible for leading that very courtroom. The misunderstanding had only just begun, but the truth waiting beneath the surface was about to change everything. The courtroom remained calm, but beneath the quiet surface, a misunderstanding was growing. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker believed he was simply enforcing what he thought was proper procedure. He saw himself as the person responsible for maintaining order, and his years wearing the badge had given him confidence in his own judgment. But he did not realize that the situation in front of him was not about control. It was about understanding the person standing on the other side of the room. Adrian Brooks continued reviewing his documents with the same patience he had shown from the beginning. He had faced difficult moments throughout his legal career, and he understood that not every challenge required an immediate response. Some moments required observation, some required patience, and some revealed the character of everyone involved. Adrian's journey to becoming chief judge was built on lessons learned over many years. Long before he entered that courtroom with responsibility over every proceeding, he was a young attorney who believed the law should protect people equally. He spent countless hours studying cases, listening to communities, and learning that justice was not only found in written rules. It was found in the way people were treated when nobody knew their background. Those experiences shaped the way he led. Adrian never believed a title made someone more valuable than another person. He believed a title created a greater responsibility to serve. That belief was why he did not immediately announce who he was. He understood that revealing his position would solve the misunderstanding, but it would not address the deeper issue. The problem was not simply that Sheriff Whitaker did not recognize him. The problem was that a decision had been made before the full truth was known. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere slowly began changing. The staff members who knew Adrian understood there was something unusual about the situation. They had seen his work, his professionalism, and the respect he had earned over the years. The attorneys preparing for the day's proceedings also began noticing that the man being questioned carried himself differently from someone who did not belong. There was a quiet confidence that came from experience, not attention. Sheriff Whitaker, however, remained focused on what he believed he was seeing. His badge gave him authority, but it also carried a responsibility he had not yet considered in that moment. Authority was not only about making decisions. It was about making the right decisions with complete understanding. Imagine spending a lifetime building a reputation based on fairness, only to have someone judge you before learning anything about your story. Imagine having the ability to change the entire situation instantly, but choosing restraint because you know your actions matter more than a quick explanation. That was Adrian Brooks. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he understood the importance of choosing the right moment. The courtroom was slowly approaching a turning point. The people inside the room could feel that there was information still hidden beneath the surface. Sheriff Whitaker believed he was dealing with someone who needed to explain why he belonged there. He did not know that the explanation would soon reveal something much greater. The man he questioned was not standing in someone else's courtroom. He was standing in his own. The courtroom had reached a moment where silence carried more meaning than words. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker still believed he understood the situation, but the people around him were beginning to recognize that there was a deeper story unfolding. The man standing quietly before them was not simply someone waiting for an explanation. He was someone who had spent years building a reputation based on fairness, patience, and dedication to the law. Adrian Brooks understood that people often judged situations based on the information available to them. That was why he never allowed a single moment to define an entire person. Throughout his career, he had seen how quickly assumptions could influence decisions. He had watched people enter courtrooms carrying stories that others could not see. He had learned that justice required looking beyond appearances and searching for the complete truth. Those lessons became the foundation of the way he served as chief judge. Adrian did not believe leadership meant standing above others. He believed leadership meant carrying the responsibility to protect fairness for everyone who entered the courtroom. Sheriff Whitaker had spent years building his own understanding of authority. To him, the badge represented experience, duty, and the ability to maintain order. But in that moment, he had forgotten an important part of that responsibility. Authority was not only about having the power to make decisions. It was about making those decisions with awareness and respect. The difference between the two men became clearer with every passing minute. Sheriff Whitaker carried visible authority. His uniform immediately showed his position. Adrian carried something different. His authority came from years of service, trust, and the respect of the people who knew his work. One could be recognized instantly. The other had to be discovered through time. Around the courtroom, staff members quietly observed the situation. They knew Adrian's dedication. They knew the countless hours he had spent preparing cases, studying the law, and ensuring that every person received a fair opportunity to be heard. They understood that the quiet man standing there was not someone who needed to prove his value. His actions had already done that. Imagine standing in a place where your achievements could change everyone's opinion in a single sentence, but choosing patience instead. Imagine knowing that you could end a misunderstanding immediately, yet deciding that the lesson mattered more than the moment. That was the choice Adrian made. He was not interested in winning an argument. He was interested in showing what justice should look like. As the morning continued, more people began noticing details that did not match Sheriff Whitaker's assumptions. The way court staff responded to Adrian, the respect in their voices, the confidence with which he carried himself. All of it suggested that there was something important being overlooked. Sheriff Whitaker began sensing that the situation was not as simple as he first believed. The person he thought needed to explain why he belonged there seemed to be the person everyone else already respected. The truth was getting closer, and when it finally arrived, it would transform the entire courtroom. Because sometimes the greatest mistake people make is not failing to recognize power. It is failing to recognize the person who carries it quietly. The moment of truth began with a simple question that changed the entire atmosphere inside the courtroom. A court staff member carefully reviewed the information connected to the man standing near the front of the room. The documents were checked, the records were confirmed, and slowly the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. Adrian Brooks was not a visitor waiting for permission to remain inside the courtroom. He was the chief judge responsible for leading that very court. The room that had once been filled with uncertainty became completely silent. Everyone understood that the situation was far different from what Sheriff Thomas Whitaker had believed. The person he thought needed to explain his presence was actually the person entrusted with protecting the fairness and order of the courtroom. Adrian remained calm as the truth became known. He did not use the moment to embarrass Sheriff Whitaker. He did not respond with anger or attempt to make the situation about himself. Instead, he stood with the same patience he had shown from the beginning. For Adrian, the important issue was never whether people recognized his title. The important issue was whether people understood the responsibility that came with positions of authority. Sheriff Whitaker began to see the situation from a different perspective. His badge had given him confidence, but now he had to consider the responsibility behind that badge. A position of authority required more than making quick decisions. It required the ability to pause, listen, and understand before taking action. The courtroom became a place where two very different ideas of power stood face to face. One was the power that came from a visible position. The other was the power that came from years of service and trust. Sheriff Whitaker had entered the room believing that authority was something you showed. Adrian showed that true authority was something you earned. Imagine discovering that the person you underestimated was the person whose decisions carried the greatest weight in the room. Imagine realizing that the person you believed had no place there was actually the person responsible for ensuring everyone else received a fair opportunity. That was the lesson unfolding inside the courtroom. Adrian's response showed why he had earned the position he held. Anyone can react when they feel disrespected, but it takes wisdom to remain focused on the bigger picture. He understood that one moment of misunderstanding did not need to become a moment of revenge. It could become a moment of learning. Around the courtroom, people watched carefully as the situation transformed. The staff members who knew Adrian's work saw the same qualities they had always respected. The attorneys saw a leader who valued fairness over personal recognition. Even Sheriff Whitaker began recognizing that the man before him represented something greater than a title. He represented the responsibility that came with justice. The truth had finally been revealed, but the most important part of the story was not simply who Adrian Brooks was. It was how he chose to respond when others did not know. Because the greatest measure of leadership is not how someone acts when everyone recognizes their importance. It is how they act when they are misunderstood. The courtroom remained quiet after the truth about Adrian Brooks was revealed, but the silence carried a different meaning now. It was no longer filled with confusion. It was filled with reflection. Everyone inside the room had witnessed a moment that changed the way they viewed authority, respect, and responsibility. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker stood facing a reality he had not expected. The man he believed needed to justify his presence was actually the person responsible for guiding the very courtroom where the misunderstanding happened. But what surprised people most was not Adrian's title. It was the way Adrian handled the moment after the truth became known. He had every opportunity to make the situation about himself. He could have focused on the mistake, the embarrassment, or the fact that his position had been questioned. Instead, he focused on something much bigger. He focused on the lesson. Adrian Brooks understood that justice was not about proving who had more power. It was about using power with wisdom and fairness. Throughout his career, he had seen how quickly people could be judged before their stories were understood. He knew that a person's appearance, clothing, or first impression could never reveal the full journey behind them. That belief was one of the reasons he became the kind of judge who listened before making decisions. Sheriff Whitaker began thinking about his own role differently. For years, He had believed that maintaining order meant making quick decisions and expecting others to follow. But the courtroom had shown him another side of leadership. Real responsibility required patience. It required humility. It required recognizing that every person deserved to be treated with respect before their importance was discovered. The difference between Adrian and Sheriff Whitaker became clear. Sheriff Whitaker had entered the room carrying the authority of a badge. Adrian had entered carrying the authority of experience. One represented a position that people could see. The other represented a reputation that people had earned through years of trust. Imagine spending decades serving your community, building a name based on fairness, and then finding yourself judged within seconds by someone who does not know your story. Imagine having the ability to change everything instantly, but choosing calmness because you understand that character speaks louder than any title. That was the choice Adrian made. He did not need to remind anyone that he was the chief judge. His actions had already demonstrated the qualities that made him worthy of that position. Around the courtroom, people began to understand that the most powerful moment was not the reveal of Adrian's identity. The most powerful moment was seeing how he responded when he had every reason to act differently. He showed that dignity does not come from how others treat you. It comes from how you choose to respond when you are misunderstood. The situation also became a reminder for everyone who worked in positions of public trust. A badge, a title, or an official role could create responsibility, but it could never replace compassion and understanding. Authority without wisdom could create mistakes. Authority guided by fairness could create trust. As the courtroom moved forward, Sheriff Whitaker had to consider the impact of his assumptions, while Adrian continued leading with the same principles that guided him for years. The lesson was clear. True leadership is not revealed when people recognize your power. It is revealed when you choose fairness even before they know who you are. The courtroom had moved beyond the moment of surprise, but the lesson inside those walls was only beginning to unfold. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker had entered the room believing he understood his responsibility, but now he was forced to consider a deeper question. What does true authority really mean? For years, he had viewed his badge as a symbol of leadership. It represented his position, his experience, and the trust placed in him by the community. But standing in that courtroom, he began to understand that a position alone could never define a person's ability to lead. Leadership was measured by judgment, fairness, and the way someone treated others when they had the power to decide. Adrian Brooks understood this better than most. As chief judge, he had spent years watching people enter his courtroom carrying different backgrounds, different challenges, and different stories. He knew that every person deserved to be heard before they were judged. That principle was not something he learned after gaining authority. It was something that guided him long before anyone knew his name. The situation with Sheriff Whitaker reminded Adrian of a lesson he had seen many times throughout his career. Sometimes people do not recognize the importance of someone because they are looking for a certain appearance of power. They expect authority to be loud. They expect it to demand attention. But Adrian had always believed that the strongest form of authority could be quiet, could come from experience, patience, and integrity. Sheriff Whitaker began reflecting on the difference between control and responsibility. Control meant having the ability to make a decision. Responsibility meant understanding the impact of that decision before making it. That difference changed the way he viewed the situation. He realized that the problem was not simply a misunderstanding. The deeper issue was how quickly assumptions could influence actions. Imagine carrying the responsibility of protecting justice, yet realizing that you almost forgot the importance of seeing the person before the situation. Imagine discovering that the person you questioned was not someone who needed to prove they belonged, but someone who had spent years making sure others were treated fairly. That realization created a powerful moment of reflection for Sheriff Whitaker. Adrian could have used the situation to make an example out of him, but he chose a different path. He believed that justice was not about creating humiliation. It was about creating understanding. His response showed the same qualities that had defined his career: patience, fairness, respect. Around the courtroom, the people watching saw something more meaningful than a simple correction of a mistake. They saw an example of leadership in action. They saw that a person's true character was revealed not when they gained power, but when they had the opportunity to use it. Sheriff Whitaker's experience became a reminder that every person in a position of trust carries a responsibility beyond their title. A badge can represent authority, but it must also represent accountability. A courtroom can represent the law, but it must also represent fairness. As the day continued, Adrian returned his focus to serving justice, while Sheriff Whitaker carried a new understanding of what leadership required. The moment had changed both men in different ways. One was reminded why humility mattered. The other was reminded why awareness mattered. And everyone who witnessed it learned that the most important part of justice is not simply knowing the rules. It is understanding the people those rules are meant to protect. The days after the courtroom incident brought a different kind of attention to both Adrian Brooks and Sheriff Thomas Whitaker. The moment itself had passed, but the meaning behind it continued to influence everyone who had witnessed what happened. It was no longer remembered as a simple misunderstanding. It became a reminder that every person in a position of authority carries a responsibility that extends beyond their title. Adrian returned to his daily duties as chief judge with the same focus and discipline he had always shown. He did not allow the situation to change the way he treated people. He continued listening carefully, reviewing each case with patience, and making decisions based on fairness rather than assumptions. For Adrian, justice was not something that only existed during important moments. It was something demonstrated through every interaction, every decision, and every opportunity to treat someone with dignity. Sheriff Whitaker also continued his work, but the experience stayed with him. He began looking at his role through a different perspective. He realized that authority could create confidence, but confidence without reflection could lead to mistakes. A badge could open doors, but it could not replace understanding. A uniform could show responsibility, but it could not replace compassion. The lesson he learned was not about losing power. It was about understanding what power was truly meant to represent. Around the courthouse, people continued discussing what they had witnessed. Many remembered that Adrian had the opportunity to make the situation about himself, but he chose something greater. He chose to focus on the principle behind the moment. He showed that justice was not about proving one person was right and another person was wrong. Justice was about creating an environment where people could learn, improve, and move forward. Imagine standing in a room where everyone finally understands your position, where every person suddenly recognizes the authority you carry. Imagine having the chance to use that moment to gain personal satisfaction, but instead choosing to use it as a lesson for others. That was the choice Adrian made. He understood that the strongest leaders do not need to remind people of their importance. Their actions already reveal it. The contrast between Adrian and Sheriff Whitaker became a lesson for everyone watching. One man learned that authority must always be balanced with humility. The other demonstrated that true strength comes from patience and self-control. Their experience showed that mistakes do not have to define a person forever. What matters is whether someone is willing to recognize those mistakes and grow from them. The courtroom had become more than a place where legal decisions were made. It had become a place where an important human lesson was revealed. People saw that respect should not depend on appearance, position, or first impressions. Every person carries a story that may not be visible at first. Every person deserves the chance to be understood before being judged. As Adrian continued serving the community and Sheriff Whitaker continued reflecting on his responsibility, the message from that day remained clear. True justice is not measured by who has the most visible authority. It is measured by who chooses fairness when given the power to decide. Because the greatest leaders are not the ones who demand recognition. They are the ones whose actions make recognition unnecessary. The story inside the courtroom continued to leave a lasting impression, not because of a single moment, but because of the choices made after that moment. Adrian Brooks understood that situations like this could reveal important lessons about people, leadership, and responsibility. While many expected the focus to remain on the mistake that happened, Adrian believed the focus should be on what could be learned from it. That belief shaped the way he approached every challenge throughout his career. He had always understood that justice was not simply about identifying who was right and who was wrong. Justice was about creating a path where people could recognize the truth, accept responsibility, and move forward with a better understanding. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker found himself thinking about that lesson more deeply than he expected. The experience changed the way he viewed the meaning of his role. He had always known that being a sheriff required discipline and commitment, but he began to understand that leadership required something more. It required the ability to recognize when assumptions could influence decisions. It required the humility to listen before acting. It required the awareness that every person encountered in a professional setting had a story that might not be immediately visible. Adrian never saw the situation as an opportunity to gain attention. He saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate the values he had spent his life protecting. He knew that anyone could speak about fairness, but true fairness was shown through actions when circumstances became difficult. His response showed why people trusted him as a leader. He did not allow the actions of one moment to change the way he treated another person. He remained focused on the principles that guided him from the beginning. Imagine having the highest authority in the room and still choosing patience over pride. Imagine having every reason to make someone feel the weight of their mistake, but choosing instead to show them why their responsibility mattered. That was the example Adrian created. He showed that real influence does not come from making others feel smaller. It comes from helping others understand something greater than themselves. The people who witnessed the situation carried that lesson with them. Court staff members remembered the calm way Adrian handled pressure. Attorneys remembered the professionalism he displayed. Others remembered that the person who had the most power in the room was also the person who showed the most restraint. Sheriff Whitaker also carried the experience forward. The lesson did not erase his responsibilities, but it changed the way he approached them. He understood that public service was not only about enforcing rules. It was about protecting trust. It was about remembering that every interaction could either strengthen or weaken the relationship between authority and the community. The courtroom had shown everyone something important. Titles can be recognized instantly, but character takes time to understand. A uniform can show a position, but it cannot reveal a person's values. A person's appearance can create assumptions, but only actions reveal the truth. As the years continued, the message from that day remained powerful. Adrian Brooks never needed to demand respect because his actions had already earned it. Sheriff Whitaker learned that the greatest responsibility of authority was not controlling a situation. It was understanding it. And the lesson that remained was simple. True justice begins when people choose to see the person before they judge the position. Years after the moment that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom, the lesson behind that day continued to live on. It was never remembered simply as a disagreement between a sheriff and a judge. It became a reminder of how powerful first impressions could be, and how important it was for people with authority to understand the responsibility that came with their roles. Adrian Brooks continued serving as chief judge with the same principles that guided him from the beginning. He never allowed the attention surrounding that moment to change his approach. He continued listening carefully, treating every person with respect, and making decisions based on fairness rather than assumptions. To Adrian, justice was not about being recognized. It was about making sure others were heard. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker also carried the memory of that day forward. The experience became a turning point in how he viewed leadership. He learned that authority was not measured by how quickly people followed an order. It was measured by the wisdom behind every decision. A badge could represent a position, but it could not replace understanding. A title could represent responsibility, but it could not replace compassion. The lesson was not about one person being powerful and another person being powerless. It was about understanding that every person deserved to be seen clearly before being judged. The courtroom had revealed something that extended far beyond one event. It showed that the strongest leaders are not always the ones who demand attention. They are often the ones who remain calm when they have every reason to react. Adrian had the opportunity to turn the moment into a personal victory, but he chose to turn it into a lesson. That choice showed the true meaning behind his position. Imagine standing in a place where everyone finally understands who you are. Imagine having the ability to remind everyone of your achievements, your title, and your authority. Yet instead, you choose to show patience because you know that your character already tells the story. That was Adrian Brooks. He did not need to prove that he belonged in the courtroom. His years of service had already answered that question. The people who witnessed the situation remembered more than the misunderstanding itself. They remembered the way Adrian handled pressure. They remembered the way he chose dignity over pride. They remembered that the person with the greatest authority in the room was also the person who showed the greatest restraint. Sheriff Whitaker's experience also became a reminder for anyone working in public service. Responsibility begins with recognizing the humanity of the people standing in front of you. Before making a decision, before forming an opinion, and before using authority, there must be an effort to understand. The final lesson from that courtroom was not about a badge, a title, or a position. It was about character. Because positions can be given, but respect must be earned. Power can be displayed, but wisdom must be demonstrated. And justice is not defined by who has the ability to speak the loudest. Justice is defined by who chooses fairness when they have the power to decide. In the end, Adrian Brooks never needed the courtroom to prove his importance. The courtroom already knew the truth. The person who appeared to have the least visible power was the person who carried the greatest responsibility. And that day showed everyone that true justice does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply stands quietly and waits for the truth to be revealed.